right, everybody. It's time for another episode of the Michael Shermer Show. My guest today is Nicholas Wade, the legendary science writer and scientist, born in Aylesbury, England, and educated at Eton and King's College, Cambridge, where he studied the natural sciences. He worked at Nature and Science, two weekly scientific magazines, for the longest time, the most prestigious of science magazines. And for many years, he was, of course, with the New York Times, where I'm sure almost all of you have read something of his work over the years. He was an editorial writer and science editor. He's the author of 4 books on recent human evolution. Before the Dawn traces how people have evolved during the last 50,000 years. The Faith Instinct argues that religious behavior evolved because of the many benefits religion brings to society. We'll have to get into that a little bit. Let's see. A Troublesome Inheritance discusses the biological basis for the emergence of human races. And the 4th volume of his trilogy, I think there's an actual word for that, but I forget what it is. The Origin of Politics. Here it is. How Evolution and Ideology Shaped the Fate of Nations, which traces evolution's reach in shaping both human nature and the structure of human societies, including politics, setting the framework for today's political situation. Nicholas, nice to see you.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks
for that nice
introduction. Thanks for all your work over the years at the New York Times and for your various books and so on. So, but before we get into the study of evolution and how it applies to politics, what's your evolutionary story? How did you get into all of this?
I suppose because when I was going to college and had to choose my major, I'd been forced to learn Latin and Greek for my school years, which is common practice in England, or was then. And I decided enough with Latin and Greek. I'll learn something I can't read on my own, and I'll take in some science. So I started reading science, but with no intention of becoming a scientist. I just wanted to know how things worked. And that led me into journalism. So my first job was on Nature, and then I came out to Washington as their Washington correspondent, and then moved to our big rival, which was Science. And from there, I went to the New York Times. So that's my short evolutionary story.
What's it like working at Nature and Science? I mean, they crank out these long issues every week. You must have a huge staff of people.
Well, I worked on the news section, which is sort of separate from the section that handles the manuscripts. So the news sections were you're concerned with political events of interest to scientists. It was somewhat of a struggle to keep these separate from the wishes of the editorial side, since if we wrote anything critical of the science community or the scientific establishment, the complaints would rain in on our editor, who would call us into his office and see if our criticisms couldn't be reined back. But by and large, at least at the time that I was there, we had a very free hand in writing about issues of concern to the scientific community.
Right. Well, there's always been scientific controversies that are dealt with by the big journals. It seems like in the last 5 years or so, maybe since the whole George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, trans woke movement, science, I'm being told by, or concerned by practicing scientists, that even these big journals, Science and Nature, have been corrupted by politics, whereas they used to be more neutral politically. What is your sense about that?
I'm afraid that's true. They've made a terrible political blunder, it seems to me, in that they stepped down from their neutral stance and started supporting woke initiatives and writing woke editorials, which is a terrible mistake. So when they now complain that science is being politicized because their grants are being taken away by the Trump administration, and they have no leg to stand on. It was they who allowed science to become politicized. They lost their credibility, and now they are reaping the whirlwind.
What is your sense of to what extent the editors at these journals and popular magazines, like I was at Scientific American for 18 years, my sense is that most of them are true believers. They actually believe, like, we have to do something to make the world a better place or to correct these terrible injustices. And, we can't do anything politically, but we can do something in our little corner of the world here by writing op-eds or whatever? Or is it more just going along to get along, and maybe they don't all believe it, but they feel like they have to go along with it because that's the movement at the moment? What is your sense about that?
Well, I think all along they should have taken a wider view of the role of science in society. I mean, science plays a vital role, and it's respected because of its independence and commitment to the truth. So as soon as you write anything that suggests you are taking a partisan position, you destroy the basis of your own popularity and position in society. So I do hope they go back to being neutral commentators, and they should get out of politics altogether. Who wants to take their political views from a scientific journal? They are not expert on politics. They should shut up and stick to matters of importance to the scientific community.
Yeah, I just posted this screenshot of several top psychology journals of the American Psychological Association, the APA. These are the top ranked journals. When you submit a paper, in the submission process, you have to, you give your name and address and all this stuff. But then they have a page that says, how do you describe your current gender identity? And here are the options: female, woman, queer gender or genderqueer, male, man, non-binary, two-spirit. I had to look that one up. Or not listed, or prefer not to answer. I just checked the box, prefer not to answer for all these. Here's another one. Do you identify as transgender? Please choose a value, yes, no, or prefer not to answer. The third one, how do you describe your sexual identity? Asexual, bisexual, gay, lesbian, pansexual, queer, straight, heterosexual, two-spirit, there it is again, not listed and prefer not to answer. And then they have a disability question. How do you describe your disability ability status? Sensory impairment, vision or hearing, a speech impairment, a learning disability, a chronic health condition, a mobility impairment, a developmental disability, a temporary impairment due to illness or injury, not listed or do not identify with a disability or impairment. I wanted to put my own box in there. None of your business. But what is it? Why is it? What's the top scientific journals? What are they? How is this even legal to ask these questions? That's one question I have.
It's a massive intellectual corruption. I've no idea how it got so far, but I think it sort of crept up on us without anyone really noticing. And suddenly it turned out that people of this ultra-left ideology had commanded the towering heights of academia and even of scientific journals, from which they have proceeded to misinform everyone and drag their profession down into the mud, it seems to me. It's not that I welcome the Trump administration taking away all these grants, but it seems to me that this is the inevitable consequence. If you betray your principles, then at some point society is going to correct you, and the correction is brutal and unpleasant and in many ways unjust. But this is what is happening, and I hope it brings us back to the normality we enjoyed before these new Marxist ideas that sex and race have no biological basis entered into the academic consciousness.
I do think that's probably what's behind all of it, in a fundamental causal way, which is what your book is about. That is the rejection of evolutionary theory from the neck up. I call them cognitive creationists.
Right.
And endorsement of the blank slate, under the belief that the only way we can re-engineer society is if we can control people's thoughts and behaviors environmentally.
Well, that's exactly right. It is cognitive creationism. It's a denial of evolution, at least as it applies to people. And it's quite extraordinary that such a movement should take place in the 21st century, and we like to think we're reasonably well informed. But no, it turns out that ideology can trump reason at every stage.
Yeah, I remember when Steve Gould and Dick Lewontin campaigned against E.O. Wilson's book on sociobiology, and they even created that group at Harvard. What is it? Science for the People, I think it was, a very Marxian name.
Right. Yes.
And here's Steve, Steve Gould, one of the greatest champions of popularizing evolutionary theory for everybody. And then he just stops at the neck. Like, of course, we evolved our organs, our bodily organs, but the brain is very plastic. Well, it is plastic, but it's not completely. It can't be blank, right? The environment has to work on some physical system.
Right. And life is too complicated for us to have to learn everything from scratch. There are all kinds of behaviors that evolution has programmed into our minds because of their survival value.
What is your sense of why it took so long? We were talking Darwin's 1859 Origin of Species and his 1869, was it, Descent of Man? And then 1871, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. I mean, it looked like we were on our way to understanding human nature, society, emotions, politics, everything from an evolutionary perspective. And then it doesn't reemerge until 1976 with Dawkins' Selfish Gene and Ed Wilson's Sociobiology and so on. It's like we lost a century. Why did that happen?
Yes, it's amazing. I mean, Darwin's theory has always been deeply unpopular because it offends so many of our ideas about ourselves. Religion, first of all, and then when that died down, the opposition has come from the sort of the ultra left. It's just amazing how deeply unpopular a theory can be, which everyone acknowledges in principle is true, yet in practice, when it gores their sacred cows, they don't believe it at all.
Yeah, I wonder if some of it is the misuses of social Darwinism by people on both the left and the right over the decades, including and especially the Nazis with their eugenics programs, but also in the United States had quite a strong eugenics program in the 1920s and 30s, euthanizing or sterilizing, tens of thousands of Americans. Maybe that just gave it such a bad name that people dropped it entirely.
Yes, I think there was an overreaction. I mean, it seems to be entirely unfair and incorrect to associate Darwinism with social Darwinism, which is a completely different idea, and one that Darwin, by the way, repudiated. I mean, social Darwinism was developed by Spencer, and it gradually grew into this monster. As you say, it was leftist academics in the U.S. who developed the eugenic programs, which were then adopted almost without change by the National Socialist regime in Germany. So that did indeed lead us down a very dangerous path. But it's ridiculous to say just because we made that gross error that therefore we're not going to consider how evolution still plays a very definite role in human affairs.
Let me read you something I wrote for initially in one of my books, The Believing Brain, and the chapter on politics, but later in a lecture. If you're liberal, I predict that you read the New York Times, listen to progressive talk radio, watch CNN, hate Donald Trump, loathe Mike Pence. This is during the first Trump round. Adore Al Gore and revere Barack Obama. You're pro-choice, pro-gun control, pro-separation of church and state, favor universal health care, vote for measures to redistribute wealth and tax the rich in order to level the playing field, and you believe that global warming is real, human-caused, and potentially disastrous for civilization if the government doesn't do something dramatic and soon. If you're conservative, I predict that you read the Wall Street Journal. You listen to conservative talk radio. You watch Fox News. You love Donald Trump. You venerate Mike Pence, despise Al Gore, and abhor Barack Obama. You're pro-life, anti-gun control, believe that America is a Christian nation that should meld church and state, against universal health care, vote against measures to redistribute wealth and tax the rich, and are skeptical of global warming and or government schemes to alter our economy in order to save civilization. How is it possible that I can predict what somebody believes just knowing like one thing and all the others are tied to it? I don't even know the person and I know their politics. How is that possible?
Well, it's very interesting how all those beliefs clump together in two separate groups. I'm happy to say that I read both the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, so
I see.
I hope I'd fall between your two groups. But it's true that political attitudes amazingly seem to be heritable to some extent. Um, I think it's like 40% of political attitudes have a sort of genetic basis, um, which is odd because back in the early days when these behaviors were presumably being formed, there were, of course, no Democrat or Republican parties. So, what I think is the best guess is that there were many problems of survival that these early societies faced, which depended on these behaviors, and you needed both sets of behaviors. For example, in some circumstances, conservatism was the best policy. You should keep things the way they were. But in other cases, if a group was moving into new territory, say, or there was a climate change, you needed to be inventive and shake things up. So in these circumstances, progressive policies were more conducive to survival. So evolution sort of worked it out that you need to keep both the instincts for both behaviors alive in a society, and that's why we still have these divisions still persist.
Yeah, here's a couple of my favorite quotes from John Stuart Mill. A party of order or stability and a party of progress or reform are both necessary elements of a healthy state of political life. And then from Bertrand Russell, slightly longer quote. From 600 BC to the present day, philosophers have been divided into those who wish to tighten social bonds and those who wish to relax them. It is clear that each party to this dispute, as to all that persists through long periods of time, is partly right and partly wrong. Social cohesion is a necessity, and mankind has never succeeded in enforcing cohesion by merely rational arguments. Every community is exposed to two opposite dangers: ossification through too much discipline and reverence for tradition, on the one hand, and on the other hand, disillusion or subjection to foreign conquest through the growth of an individualism and personal independence that makes cooperation impossible. So it seems like that's a observation that you're arguing in your book has a deep evolutionary origin.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, especially the need for a party of order and a party of change from Locke, and social cohesion is also important, and this is connected with the nation state or the and the tribe, the nation state being the tribe's sort of modern successor, and social cohesion is very important both internally and externally for fighting enemies, but it can also lead you astray, as we see from the many national excesses. When a nation feels itself so powerful, it will go to war on its neighbors. All these are severe downsides of excessive social cohesion.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll get to nationalism and tribalism in a bit. But let's kind of unpack the causal pathway from genetics and personality and temperament to political choice, political party choice. So are you arguing, if I understand it, just from a very early age, we, by temperament, say, take you discuss the big five personality traits: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, introversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, OCEAN. And so if you are, let's say, high in openness to experience, high in agreeableness, you like travel, you like change, you're comfortable with unpredictability of environments, maybe you just sort of migrate toward other people that are like that, and those people tend to vote Democrat. So it's not like you sit down and look at the planks in the Democratic Party platform and go, yeah, these have the best arguments. It's more like, well, these are my people. I just like being around them. I like their attitudes, and this is our party. So yeah, I'm going to go with that. Okay, what are our good arguments? And conservatives, right, high in conscientiousness, maybe lower, slightly lower in openness to experience. You uncomfortable with unpredictability of environments. You like things that are stable and are going to last a long time, and you can count on them. And the people that also enjoy that, they party together, they hang out together, they marry each other, and so on. And so then again, after the fact, you go, well, the GOP has the best arguments on pro-choice or I mean, on the abortion issue or on guns or immigration or whatever. But the arguments come after the fact. Is that something like what you're arguing?
Yes, I think there's a lot of truth in that. The psychologist Jonathan Haidt has described this process very well, and that he argues there's a moral intuition which works beneath the level of consciousness, and your moral intuitive sense sort of works out all these emotional ideas, and then it pops into your mind a moral position, which you then use your argumentative powers to support. So the emotional decision comes first, and the argument second. Um, I think there's a lot in that, because it sort of emphasizes how much events at the unconscious level drive our decisions.
And a lot of this data comes from twin studies in behavior genetics. Can you explain how they get like 40% of your attitudes about politics or religion or whatever are heritable? How do they figure that out from these twin studies?
Well, it's by comparing identical twins with identical twins who've been brought up in the same family with twins who've been adopted. So both sets of twins have identical genetics, but the adopted ones have different environments. So the more something stays the same between twins with the same environment, the more the more it stays the same with twins with different environments, the more likely it is to have a genetic component.
Right. So if you have identical twins raised in the same environment, identical twins separated at birth and raised in different environments, radically different environments, even that latter one are still far more alike than, say, siblings raised in the same environment or siblings raised in different environments. So you could have kind of all the different options, and then score their attitudes on a whole scale of different beliefs and so on. Not to mention behaviors and weird little anomalies like what toothpaste they like, or they snap their rubber band on their wrist, and weird things like that.
No one can explain that.
Yeah, well, I think there's also, this is tangential to your book, but I think it's a serious problem in social science, is the non-shared environment, or all the stuff not explained after you've taken into account genetics and environment. They're still different. In many cases, surprisingly different. Why would they not be almost identical? I mean, they're identical, almost identical genetically, and yet they're still different, in terms of behaviors, not identical. So there's something else, which I just call contingency as a basket, but, randomness, chance, one twin was on the top and the other one was on the bottom in the womb, or one twin got the upper bed, the other one got the lower bed, or one went left instead of right. The dog barked at one and scared him, not the other one. Or, there's just, a million little things that happen in a life as it unfolds that can tweak people down different paths.
Right. I think that's true.
I think it's an unappreciated factor by social scientists, because what do you do with that? What am I supposed to do with randomness? Right?
Right.
In my equation of predicting human behavior. Anyway, that's a separate subject. Okay, so now let's look at some of the social experiments you discussed, like the kibbutzen. You start off talking about the kibbutzen. What is that? What are those, and what did that tell us about human nature?
Well, it's an amazing social experiment, although it didn't start out as such. The kibbutzen were designed by Jewish refugees who left Europe in the 1930s and started life anew in Israel on these collective farms. And they determined that they would change the structure of human society by removing the patriarchy, the father's tyranny over his wife and children. And they did that by arranging that children would be reared separately from their parents. They would be allowed to see their parents for an hour or so a day. but basically they'd be raised communally. And the other remarkable innovation was that everyone would have the same pay. So uh, uh, there were no pay gradations. Everyone was paid the same, whatever job they did. And because they were paid communally, the father had no financial control over the mother. So women were liberated from the patriarchal role of their husbands. So this sounds great on paper, and it's wonderful that someone has sort of tried this experiment. And maybe in an ideal world, that's the way society should be operated. But evolution has arranged things otherwise. Evolution has arranged for parents to love their children, so they want to have their children with them, particularly women. And on the pay reward side, people are very upset if they are paid the same as someone who is slacking off, or is not as useful to society as they are. So these two processes were misaligned with human nature as evolution has designed it. So the kibbutzim, although they lasted for many years and still exist, though in somewhat changed form, they they uh, they they showed what happens if you try and abolish the central features of human nature. You just have societies that make people uncomfortable that they don't want to live in.
Right. So the parents want to see their children. Why is that? Well, there's obviously good genetic reasons for that. You talk about the Westermark effect, or the incest taboo. Another one of these traits that Jonathan Haidt talks about is moral foundations theory. I should point out that there's some criticisms of that. Kurt Gray wrote a book about, sort of saying that those 5 dimensions that Jonathan Haidt talks about in moral foundations theory are all forms of harm. There's just one central underlying foundational to our morality, that is harm avoidance. So take, for example, his now famous thought experiment of Mark and Julie, brother and sister, go out on a vacation together, and they decide it would be really rewarding and interesting and fun if they had sex. And so they decided to do that. They found it very pleasurable. They used 2 forms of birth control so she wouldn't get pregnant. They decided to keep it as a secret to themselves. They didn't tell anybody. And it all worked out just fine. How do you feel about that, right? So I used to ask my students this, and they're like, "What? Oh, that's gross." Okay, why? Why is it wrong? Well, just because she'll get pregnant. Now they use 2 forms of birth control. Well, people will find out, and they won't respect them. Nope, they kept it a secret. Well, I don't know. It's just gross, right? So that's what you're talking about there, that kind of emotional rejection of sex between anyone who was raised together. This is the Westermark effect.
Yes, it's such an interesting story that Haidt constructed, and it sort of illustrates so well his point that we have emotional rules written into our subconscious that we cannot even explain or articulate. And this is a totally unexpected finding from the kibbutzim, which was that people who've been raised together in the same kibbutzim educational group called a kavutza, which lasts from, I think, age 6 to age 12, they simply didn't marry each other. There were no marriages between members of the same kibbutz, even though no one was telling them they couldn't get married. And this presumably must be a genetic instruction, since it wasn't a cultural instruction. And this seemed to more or less settle the sort of great debate between Westermark and Freud, Westermark having said, well, this is a matter of nature and evolution, and Freud who said, no, it's cultural. The answer seems to be it's genetic.
Yeah. So, I mean, back to Kurt Gray's critique of moral foundations theory is that even that effect is really just harm reduction. Why shouldn't siblings have sex? Well, because of genetic inbreeding, and we've seen that happen experimentally, socially, I should say, or politically, with some of these European families in the early modern period, just marrying each other and so on. And they mostly produced a bunch of dullards who had weird genetic defects.
The
And
Habsburg lip.
yeah, the Habsburg lip. Yeah, exactly. Um, so that underlying it is just harm reduction. So, but of course, no one's running 23andMe tests on these kibbutzim kids, right? So the program seems to be anyone that you've spent a lot of time with growing up is not somebody you want to have sex with or you're going to be attracted to sexually as an adult. That seems to be the program.
Yeah, presumably that is the behavioral rule that that evolution has inscribed in our brain. Obviously, it wouldn't be you shall not uh, marry someone you grew up with because of the danger of genetic inbreeding, and how would you sort of program that neurologically? But something along the lines you suggest, if these people were growing up with you under the same roof and not a suitable marriage partner, it's sort of easier to imagine how that kind of behavioral circuit might have been laid down.
Yeah. Well, I have a stepsister, so no genetic relation, but I grew up with her and it would be, it's the same, like, oh, gross.
Right.
So, yeah. So, and then egalitarianism, hunter-gatherer groups are often described as egalitarian. And I think you talk about Christopher Boehm in your book. I think it was he that pointed out that it's kind of an enforced egalitarianism. I mean, they have to have rules and norms about meat sharing and tool sharing and so on because they may not actually want to be egalitarian.
Yes, that's right. Anyone who tries to boss his fellows around is quickly cut down to size and, if necessary, ostracized. So these societies, they need leaders for particular purposes, like directing a hunt or something. But the leader then has to sort of step down immediately. That function is over, or else he will be in grave trouble. People will say he's a witch, and that can lead to being executed. And they were very uh, uh, they were very coercive, these early societies. And even though we may admire that egalitarianism, it had it had one very unfortunate effect, which is it condemned these societies to stagnation. Because if no one could sort of get richer than his fellows, if no one could sort of invent something and thereby sort of seem better than the others, you just could not change. So these societies stayed the same for 200,000 years, which is very, very remarkable when you think of the progress the way we've become used to in recent centuries. For most of our existence, we had no progress at all.
Yeah. Well, we covered the anthropology wars in the 90s when Napoleon Chagnon got attacked for describing the Yanomamo people as fierce people. Of course, he didn't mean they eat fiercely or make love fiercely, only that, they fight a lot. But all these hunter-gatherer groups fight a lot. And what are they fighting over? Mostly women, territory, status, food. But a lot of it's guys fighting over women. And that, he documented that the most successful warriors had the most wives or whatever they were calling them then, and children. And
That's right.
I don't know if you've seen Lauren Betzig's data she went through the Old Testament and just kind of documented all the patriarchs and kings and high status males and how many wives and concubines and children they had. And it's just a direct linear relationship. The more power they had, the more wives and children they had.
I think this is the way our male psyche is wired up. And the more we can spread our genes around, the more successful we are in Darwinian terms. So in those societies that succeeded the hunter-gatherers, polygamy was very common because the men who rose to the top, who gained political power, used it to enjoy more wives. And that was good for them, but it's very destabilizing for society because if some men have a lot of wives, then many other men have no wives at all. And this is destabilizing for society because they will try either overthrow their society or they'll be sent off to make war on neighboring societies. It leads to a great sort of unsatisfied need, which eventually was addressed by the institution of monogamy, which I think is a very good example of how you can modulate human nature. If you go right against human nature, you're looking for trouble. But with the sort of right cultural rules, you can change people's behavior so that polygamy is now a thing of the past throughout the world, and I think our societies are more stable because of it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that's why the federal government, U.S. government, banned polygamy. And when the state of Utah wanted to become a state in 1896, I think it was, and they were practicing polygamy, the Mormons were, they said, well, you got to drop that. And they conveniently got a new revelation from God saying, I've changed my mind about the plural marriage thing. We're back to women and men only and no plural, what they call it. Celestial marriage was the other term for it. Yeah, so give us a brief history of how that happened. Was it mostly top down, like the federal government, the national government said, okay, we're not going to do this anymore. We're going to, you have to be married to just one person?
Well, on a global scale, it seems to be in bicultural osmosis. And the idea of monogamy seems to have started with ancient Greek and ancient Roman law. And then, of course, it was endorsed by the Catholic Church, and in more recent times has sort of spread throughout the world. I think India and China adopted monogamy, within the last century. So now it's pretty much a universal custom.
Yeah. Right. And so the other problem is that those young men without wives and not getting married and sexually frustrated and so on are also hanging out with other young men who are similarly frustrated. So this also increases violence, gangs, violence, and just general disorder. Joseph Henrich, I think it was. I was looking to see I forgot if you discussed him in his book. Weird.
It's a fascinating book. I don't think I do mention it because he takes an entirely cultural approach.
Yeah.
And he just avoids genetics entirely.
He was arguing, I think, that it was when the Catholic Church first insisted on not just monogamous marriage, but also inheritance to the first son, primogeniture. Yeah, that's the word. That changed a lot of cultural history in the Middle Ages, early modern period.
That's right. I mean, it's clear that the Church had a very deliberate and somewhat insidious program of essentially defunding the tribes in Europe by transferring tribal wealth through inheritance laws to the Church. So it started off by saying you couldn't marry inside the family, and then you couldn't marry your second cousin or your third cousin or your fourth cousin. And then there were all kinds of customs the tribes had of keeping wealth in the tribe, because very often in those days, where people tended to die young, there was no male heir. So there were rules like the levirate, whereby you would marry if your brother died, you would marry his widow. All these, often there was adoption, so you would adopt someone to be your heir. All these stratagems kept wealth within the tribe. So the Church attacked every one of those and suggested that you should leave your wealth to the poor, i.e. the Church. So the Church ended up owning enormous amounts of property, both in England and France and Germany in the Middle Ages. Like 20-30% of the arable land was in the Church's hands.
That's amazing. That's political power. Or just go to the Vatican and see all the artwork that they stole. So what is the natural origins of the family? This is another one of these politicized issues where the left says, it takes a village to raise a child and more the kibbutzim kind of thing, and marriage isn't that important. and the right, of course, saying the a man and a woman and children, that's the natural order of things. If we are practicing polygamy so much and monogamy has to be enforced from the top down, what are we by nature then? How do you think about that?
Well, the importance of the family becomes very clear if you look at primate history. So the family is unique to humans. Chimps and gorillas have no such arrangement. And the reason the family evolved, it's argued, and I think very plausibly, is because of the uh, of the long gestation time of human children and the fact that they were born even then very prematurely, so their heads didn't get too big to fit through the woman's pelvis, and therefore very helpless. So for children to survive, you needed two parents to look after them. And so the human pair bond is unique in the primate world, and that is the basis of marriage. I mean, marriage is a formalization of the pair bond that evolution created for the survival of children. So that, I think, is the basis of the family.
Yeah, I've heard anthropologists describe this as practicing serial monogamy. So,
Um, you mean if
you're
if your
monogamous
wife,
for a while, and then, well, this is more of a males trading for younger wives as they get older, that kind of thing.
right? Well, there's exceptions to the rule, but still, I think the
Yeah.
basic concept is you need a man and a woman to raise children successfully, and I think that's a good argument.
Well, because our natural gestation period would be, I'm told, 18 months, not 9 months. But
Oh, that's fascinating. I didn't know that.
yeah,
Huh.
yeah. But the pelvis can't, take that. So 9 months is it, and then you're basically still helpless for the next 9 months. So, yeah. Well, I mean, there was that recent book, I don't know, 6 months ago or so, by an economist. I forget her name, but basically making the argument from a purely economic perspective why having a man and a woman in a home with two incomes or whatever is better. And it's like, really? I mean, somebody has to document this. Isn't it obvious having two hands instead of one? Yes, a single mom can raise a kid just fine. But we're talking about on average, it's better to have two than one, right? Just anyway. Okay, so that's the origins of the family. Then walk us through from these small bands and tribes to chiefdoms, states, and then ultimately nation states. How did that happen?
Well, I think the egalitarianism of the early hunter gatherers sort of disappears as soon as the agricultural revolution comes with the fading of the last ice age. People settle down and they live in much larger groups. So these larger groups need a different form of organization, and that's when you have the autocracy that you see in gorilla chimp societies are restored in the human line. So you have these autocracies which are the only way really to organize a society, though with the help of religious ideas that the autocrat uses to his own advantage. And and the autocrat will keep himself in power by doling out favors to an elite group of supporters. And that basically is even today is the way autocratic societies operate. Excuse me. But I think a very important step toward the liberal democratic state with which we're familiar was when the ruler himself came under a system of law. So as soon as you have the ruler having to obey the law, or indeed owing his position in society as the defender of the law, that's when societies become more inclusive. When you have when rival power centers, alternative power centers, allowed to develop, you have much greater economic freedom as well as political freedom, and this leads to a much more efficient and freer kind of society. one that's very difficult to develop. I mean, it takes years, it takes centuries to develop a society of that kind. If you look at its emergence in England, say, and from the Magna Carta, where the barons forced the king to yield some of his power to the Glorious Revolution, which was the beginning of parliamentary democracy in the late 18th century. And that's about sort of 500, 600 years of social, cultural development. And it's not easily attained. You need lots of conditions to be right for a peaceful society like that to emerge.
Yeah, well, that reminds me again back to Christopher Boehm's work on how these small hunter-gatherer groups dealt with bullies and big men and people that wanted to take advantage or even free ride. And that required, ostracization, gossip about them, and trying to enforce the rules on them. And if worse comes to worse, you just take the guy out for a hunt with all your buddies and don't come back with him. Come back without him. And and they distributed the killing amongst themselves so that nobody is solely responsible. This was a group decision, that kind of thing. In a way, by nature, the moment you have power, well, power corrupts, absolutely, and all that is true. So it requires now institutions and laws. A bunch of these barons that get together, like a bunch of chimps that are going to combat the male dominant chimp. The beta males that kind of group together to fight the alpha male. It takes a bunch to make that happen. So by nature, we shouldn't be surprised like about the Kim regime in North Korea, or even here with Trump and his nepotism, or Biden with his nepotism. That's the natural course of things. So it takes some effort to resist that.
Yeah, I think that's right. The kind of society we are fortunate to live in has been the exception rather than the rule in human history. The victory of democracy is not inevitable, and we need to fight to keep what we have before we lose it.
Yeah. So simultaneously, the rise of religion is wrapped up in this, as you argue. I didn't read your previous book on religion, but I want to read that now. Is your argument something like, as these small bands and tribes coalesce into larger chiefdoms and states, nobody knows what everybody's doing. So we need some kind of internal policeman. So you have police, but the police can only go so far. So you need people to have in themselves a moral sense. And so religion is a way of saying, even if the police are not watching you, there's an eye in the sky. The Godhead is watching you. And so you have to have an internal moral compass. And societies require that because we can't police everybody. So is it something like that?
Yes, I think that's a big part of it. I think the prime function of religion is to institute social cohesion. It's to get everyone on the same page. So in early societies, it will be through these communal dances that lasted through the night, and in modern, much more sophisticated religions, it's through sort of church services and church dogma and the whole hierarchy of priests and bishops that enforces the ideas. But the basic function is to get society marching together for whatever purposes the rulers deem are necessary. So religion plays primarily a very important role in enforcing whatever moral code the society has, as you pointed out. This is its internal role. It has an important external role in galvanizing a society to put all its energies into warfare for its survival. So I think this was an important step in the evolution of religion, and the societies that develop social cohesion through religion tended to overthrow the societies that had a less developed religious instinct.
Mm.
So religions are often blamed by atheists for supporting wars. But I think that's an unfair rap. their influence takes place at an earlier stage. They support a society and its leaders in doing whatever it is they deem necessary for the society. So it's the leaders political leaders who take a society to war, and religion shouldn't be blamed that specifically.
That's an interesting point. I guess you'd argue today then, in more secularized governments, it's nationalism that's uniting people.
Yes, of which religion is still a very important component. I think there are many other components to nationalism, which basically is the tribe in modern garb, but instead of kinship, which is the glue of tribes, instead of actually being related to other members of your nation, you sort of relate to them because of all the things you share in common, like ethnicity, probably religion, language, culture. Uh, uh, all these shared behaviors allow you to think of your neighbor as your brother.
So if I see you every week in the pews or in the religious services, it doesn't really matter what the rituals are, that you're doing the rituals and I'm doing the rituals. So we have common knowledge between us. We're all on the same team. We're in this together. It doesn't really matter what the rituals are. It's the doing them together.
I think so, yes. But everyone has to have the same ritual. A religion has to enforce orthodoxy, or it'll soon have lots of heretic sects trying to split away from it. So
this is why
religious
heretics
orthodoxy
have to be punished so dramatically.
Yes, very
publicly.
severely, because they're such a threat to the cohesion of religion and therefore society.
Yeah, I think this goes a long way to explaining cancel culture on the left. It's the same thing. It's like they're deviating from the orthodoxy of whatever trans woke. This is our belief, and it's not enough to say I disagree with you in your theory about trans or whatever. That you should be fired from your job, right? I mean, punished where you lose your livelihood. I mean that
Right.
has long baffled me. Like, why does this person have to lose his job? This is why,
Right.
maybe.
I think that's right. Yes, it shows the sort of vituperative aggression, emotions in human nature, many of which are justified if you have some religion, and you can accuse people of disobeying the orthodoxy. So wokeism is not defined as a religion, but it operates in just the same way.
Here's what you write. Religion also serves as a guarantor of morality. It was widely believed until modern times that people would not keep their oaths or obey the law unless they feared divine punishment. Quote, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other, wrote John Adams in 1798. Or as George Washington said in his presidential farewell address of 1796, quote, let it simply be asked, where is the security for property, for reputation, for life, if the sense of religious obligation deserts the oaths which are the instruments of investigation in the courts of justice, close quote from Washington. Then you continue. And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion, whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, reason and experience. Oh, this isn't you speaking. This is Washington. Sorry.
Washington, yeah.
Yeah. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on the minds of peculiar structure, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. I want to ask you if you're familiar with David Sloan Wilson's group selection theory of religion, and more generally, what you think about group selection as an argument.
Well, it's a very attractive theory, and it does explain a lot. Like all our behaviors that support society's social cohesion, all our religious behaviors, all our moral behaviors. These are all things that paradoxically do not help the individual.
Right.
So evolutionary theory says we all want to survive, we'll do anything for our personal survival. But here are a whole suite of behaviors where we seem to subordinate our personal behavior to the needs of society. And it's very hard to explain in classic evolutionary terms how that came about. So Sloan Wilson's group selection theory does do that.
But is
Now
it?
Darwin also believed in
Yeah.
group selection, and every biologist knows it's very unwise to bet against Darwin, although they often do. So, I think maybe Darwin will be vindicated in time as we understand more.
Maybe, I've read Pinker's and Dawkins' critique of group selection, and they make a pretty good argument. I mean, a lot of this that David Sloan Wilson is talking about, like studying different religious groups and their cohesiveness, maybe it's just cultural selection, not biological selection. In other words, the most successful groups are those that are more cohesive, and religion is a part of that. But may that not just be modern historical, cultural, social, political change and survival and so on, not an actual target of natural selection in a genetic sense? Or maybe it is individuals as part of a group, but it's still individual selection. I'm trying to remember exactly what Dawkins and Pinker argued against now on group selection, but it was something like that.
I think the best argument that religion must have a genetic basis is its universality. And
Mm,
every known society has a religion, and it's hard to argue it's just cultural because uh, most religions are very expensive. They require an enormous amount of investment of time and resources, which people wouldn't do unless there was some enormous countervailing advantage. That, that that's, I think, the reason for assuming there's a genetic basis. Now, how that genetic basis arose, we don't really know.
mm.
But it's intuitively, if the more religious groups defeated the less religious groups, I mean, that would do it. And there there are ways in which that uh, could happen. Um, maybe now's not the time to get into the arguments. Because they're quite detailed. But suffice it to say, most biologists, as you indicate, do not accept group selection. But I think it's still a possibility,
Mm.
and I think there may be something to it.
Yeah. Well, then that brings us to the origins of morality. Um, and you talk about, like primate morality. I always liked Franz de Waal's idea of kind of pre-moral sentiments. I mean, we wouldn't exactly call bonobos and chimps, practicing moral thoughts or anything like that, but they have moral emotions. They get angry or jealous or revengeful and so on. But I guess one of the arguments for group selection is that it helps explain the origins of morality. The problem of altruism. Why should I be good to you? Why should I be nice to you? Well, maybe you'll do something nice for me. Reciprocal altruism, I'll scratch your back if you'll scratch mine. Okay. But why would I tip a waiter in some foreign country I'm never going to go to again? Even if I do, I'm not likely to go to that restaurant. And even if I do, she's probably not working that night. So why would I do that, right? And so then there's different arguments about this. Well, I know what I did. So, in an Aristotelian, virtue ethics way, by acting virtuous even when no one's watching, I then become a more virtuous person. And in a positive cycle like that, then that gets reinforced by my group and so on. I don't know. How do you think about why the problem of altruism, why we would be nice to other people and so on?
Well, there's the kin selection theory, which says that by helping the immediate members of your family, you are still that's sort of, if you help your brother, that's half as good as getting your own genes into the next generation. So I think that's fine as far as it goes. But beyond that, I think just as a general moral sense is present in our mind that tells us to be nice to each other. I mean, there are anti-parallel emotions that tell us to be horrible to each other, but we have this basic uh, sense that we all belong. If we belong to the same society, someone's in the same group as you, then you should go out of your way to help them.
So they're extended family, community, even society of strangers, they become honorary family members because we've inculcated them in or incorporated them into our moral circle.
I think that's right. I mean, when you appraise a stranger, you decide maybe at a subconscious level, but very quickly if they're sort of part of your group or not part of your group, if they're likely to be hostile or likely to be friendly. And once that decision is made one way or the other, then you'll act on it, either be guardian toward them or else treat them almost as if they were a member of the family.
Yeah. Jared Diamond tells this funny story about one of the first times he went birding in Papua New Guinea, which he did every summer for decades, and that's how he came to write Guns, Germs, and Steel and all that research. But initially, he was just interested in birds, right? So he went to Papua New Guinea, hired a local to take him out on the single track trails to go birding, and then one day they come across some stranger. And Jared's like, "Oh, let's go talk to that guy and see what birds he's seeing." And his guide is like, "Are you out of your mind? We don't know who he is. He could kill us." Jared's like, "Oh, oh."
That's the nature of New Guinea society. There are about sort of 600 languages are spoken in New Guinea, and each valley has its own tribe, and all the tribes are completely hostile to each other.
Right.
So there are grave dangers in sort of moving a few kilometers from your native village. I suspect that's how we lived for much of our early history.
Yeah. I make one more move in addition to kin selection and reciprocal altruism. Again, what if it's a total stranger and so on? And so I then take Bob Triver's theory of deception and self-deception, and that if I believe it, whatever it is I'm saying, really truly believe it, you're less likely to think I'm lying because I'm not giving off cues, body language cues or subtle facial expressions or whatever that you might detect if I'm lying. If I actually believe the lie. Okay, so let's not say lies. Let's just say I want to be a good person, and if I actually believe that this is good to help you and I feel good about it, then you're going to really get a sense that I'm a genuinely honest, good person that you can trust, and that I'm not just a psychopath pretending to be a good person. Because if you interact with somebody a lot, this is how we find out about psychopaths. They eventually trip up because they don't really believe it themselves. There's pretending.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I'm not a poker player, but
yeah.
I guess that these are the kind of rules you have to learn if you spend your time deceiving people.
Well, this is in part, this kind of theory of self-domestication, humans self-domesticated. We become less violent in an evolutionary perspective. This is Richard Wrangham's theory in part. But also Christopher Bohm makes this point that, how you interact with these other people very much matters in terms of the group cohesiveness and so on. I forgot, I lost my thread there, but but you get the idea that it's it's kind of deeply ingrained. So to me, do you need a religious divine command theory to explain good and evil and or good and bad behavior? To me, it seems like if we have an evolved sense of right and wrong that we truly believe is right and wrong, and we act on it, that's as foundational and external as it gets. In other words, it's not just relative to me, my culture, my tribe, but it's universal. The universal sense of guilt, for example. Now, maybe the Catholics want you to feel guilty about this and the Protestants want you to feel guilty about that. But why should you feel guilty about anything, right? And this is your point about the deeper evolutionary origins of these emotions. They're in there and they come bundled with the species. So it's not exactly external in the sense that theists want it to be, divine command theory, but it's pretty external to me personally.
I think maybe morality and religion evolved as two different systems, although nowadays they enforce each other. You can often see evolution taking a false turning. There's a very interesting argument that music was a sort of proto-language, and because it wasn't sufficiently expressive, then the alternative form of language, which now know today, developed. But there are many commonalities between the two. So evolution sort of made an experiment that failed, but didn't sort of abolish it entirely. And so maybe morality and religion are two of evolution's experiments that it very ingeniously combined, so they reinforce each other.
Yeah. Yeah, I always like those debates about whether music and art are spandrels, just kind of accidental byproducts of some other feature of human nature. Cheesecake, as Pinker calls it, or if
Right.
they're adaptive. Well, we don't have to get into that. All right, let's talk about the origins of male-female differences and how that shapes our political institutions.
Well, I think it's clear that evolution has evolved very different roles for men and women, which of course is a very efficient thing to do. If you look at, for example, ant societies, where you see all these different castes that have evolved, workers and queens and drones. So we haven't had enough evolutionary time to develop genetically different castes, but nonetheless, we have had time to develop different roles for men and women. And sort of basically, men are sort of specialized for warfare and also for forming sort of long-range friendships or coalitions outside the family, which is why men have invented, I think, all the institutions of our societies. Whereas women are specialized, obviously, for childbirth and for sort of local support groups that will help them bring up a child with greatest chance of survival. So these two roles are built into human nature. Now, it doesn't mean they can't be modified. So I think everyone would agree it was a great thing when women were emancipated from the home and domestic duties and entered into the workforce on an equal footing with men. So that is great for women, and it's great for society too, because it draws on this previously untapped pool of talent. But I think you do get into difficulties if you press that to extremes by saying, well, men and women are identical, and therefore in any profession, if 50% of the jobs don't go to women, that is prima facie evidence of discrimination. I mean, this I think is very harmful. It's very unfair to men when you set a 50% quota for all women on corporate boards, and it's very bad for society. And the reason is that men and women are not the same. They have different emotions. They have different life goals. I mean, men, for example, will put everything into their career because in the course of evolution, they have been taught, as it were, that unless they put everything into finding a wife, then in Darwinian terms, they will be nothing. So men will do everything they can in pursuit of that goal, whereas for women, it's much easier to get a husband. Their evolutionary focus is elsewhere. It's on how best to raise their children and see that they survive. So when you sort of move to the workforce, to the workplace, for example, men will put everything they can into scientific discovery or building a corporation. They will work those long hours because they are motivated to, whereas women have a much more balanced sense of home and office and are less willing to work that hard. So in a sort of free, open society, everyone should be judged on their merits and allowed to do the job they do best. To set an artificial quota of any kind is going to lead to resentment and to unfair treatment of the people who are at the receiving end of a quota.
Yeah. I should point out that political concern about asymmetries in jobs between men and women only applies when the female ratio is less than 50%. If it's more, then nobody cares, right? I mean, there's way more female linguists than male, or and I think marine biology. I think most of the biological sciences now. I think there's more MD women MDs now,
Right.
and so on. Nobody thinks that there's systemic bigotry against males in those professions.
Oh, right. It's become a political issue. I mean, it's moved over from a, a very understandable desire to treat women fairly and free them from the essential seclusion of the home, uh, a- and it's been used by some women for personal ends to open up more jobs for themselves.
Hmm.
I think, and uh, that really is a very disruptive process. I mean, in science, for example, women have consistently complained that they are discriminated against and that they should have more research funds and more tenured jobs and more representation in journals. And there have been an enormous number of studies of exactly how women are treated in science. And the largest of these studies, which is an amalgamation of some 15,000 previous
Mm-hmm.
studies, found there was no discrimination against women. Uh, and in one category, in tenured jobs, there was slight discrimination against men.
Hmm.
The one discrimination against women was the pay was not exactly equal, but unequal pay has many different causes. So if there's no discrimination against women in science, where it's been intensively studied, I think one should be very careful of assuming there's discrimination against women in other
Mm-hmm.
walks of life, especially in this society where it's sort of broadly accepted that women should do what they want and rise to whatever their level of ability is.
Mm-hmm. I should point out that meta-analysis you mentioned was by Stephen Ceci and his colleagues, whose liberal bona fides are second to none. There's no discrimination. We looked for it. We were expecting to find it. We didn't find it, right? And so the question then is, okay, first, why are there some asymmetries there? And it's mostly just in the STEM fields, okay? So you're talking, physics, engineering, astronomy, math, and so on. Are we to believe that college professors and deans and the hiring committees and so on in academia are misogynistic? I thought,
Right.
I mean, these are the most liberal places on the planet.
Exactly. It's the last place you'd expect to find misogyny. So the charges of discrimination are ridiculous on the face of it.
And then I point out, in terms of like Fortune 500 companies, what does it take to get on the C-suite of a Fortune 500 company? Well, you got to work like 80 hours a week for, years. And
Right.
I have to tell you, I don't want to do that.
I
I like, enjoying my life here, riding my bike, playing with my kid, just I work, but I don't want that. And most people don't, not just most women, most people don't want that. Right. So you're really talking about males that are 6 standard deviations out from the mean of, just high need of achievement. And they're willing to sacrifice their marriages and families and so on to work those 80 hours. And women are just on average less likely to want to do that. Why would feminists want to give up that idea of a healthy, more balanced life that most people prefer, right? In a way, they're kind of caving into the patriarchal standard of this is what success looks like. You become a CEO of a Fortune 500 company and you have no life outside of that. Why is that the standard?
Well, I think they have an axe. They have an axe to grind. If you keep saying we're being maltreated, there's male discrimination against us, then you will have more jobs and funds coming your way. So it's somewhat selfish
Well, it might be
reasons.
strategic. Yeah. Yeah, that's possible. Though I think most people just believe it, just like the income inequality. When you adjust for number of hours worked and so on, then there is no income inequality. Anyway, it was, I think it was Milton Friedman who pointed out back in the 60s that if companies really could hire equally talented women at 60% on the dollar of what they have to pay men, they would just hire all women. I mean,
You would
because
think, yes.
the bottom line is we just want to make money, and payroll is one of our biggest expenses.
I'm sure there are cases of discrimination in particular times and places,
Yes, of course. Right.
but
Yeah.
overall,
Yes.
I believe there's not now.
All right, let's talk about other kinds of inequality. You talk about Gregory Clark's work. His book was great. The Sun Also Rises, SON, and his data showing that there's not much governments can do about income inequality and status inequality and so on. It's just multi-generational, and it just goes on and on. He not just in England, but also I think he looked in China also.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary finding. I was amazed when I read it, and I don't think it's been sort of generally absorbed. But he's saying that societies have been mobile for way back in history in such a way that the people who are talented in a certain way, he doesn't define exactly how, have risen to the top, and they will stay there for a long time, not forever, because gradually these elite families will lose whatever the edge they had, and they will sink back to the norm, but they will stay there for a very long time. So that the efforts that governments make to increase opportunity often tend to reward the middle class, the middle and upper classes, because they are most able to take advantage of them. They are the most educable. And if you set up a science school where you admit people by merit, you'll find most of these places are taken by people from the middle class, not the lower class. So this flies in the face of our common conception that there are many talented people at the bottom in the bottom rows of society, or the poorest classes, I should say, who are denied the possibility to rise up. And there's certainly some of those, but probably far fewer than we imagine. So this means, there are very difficult political implications that arise from this, but essentially it suggests that societies are stratified in terms of ability, and these layers change over time, but very gradually. And moreover, that this stratification has existed from way back in history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's
And that
deeply
even though
ingrained.
you have, even in aristocratic societies, Clark points out that something like half of the aristocrats get killed in every generation. So their numbers are replaced by sort of rich merchants who buy themselves a title,
Mm-hmm.
and thus enter the aristocracy. So there is much more of a turnover of talent than we generally imagine.
The nouveau riche. You have this
Right,
quote.
but everyone was nouveau riche at one
Yes,
time.
that's
They just
right, of course.
they hang around and they become ancien riche.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I should point out on the previous topic of that study showing, I think it was in Sweden, the least discriminatory against women, the most opportunistic for women in all the STEM fields and so on, and all fields, that the asymmetry is even greater there than in the United States. So where women are free to choose, they're just choosing some professions over others. And that should be what we're striving for, right? I mean, just let people do whatever they want. Don't force women to go into some field because you have this ideology it has to be 50-50.
I think so. That all quotas should be scrapped, and we should find some other way of encouraging whatever social justice ideals we're after.
Yeah, I remember I used to belong to this astronomy club, of which there were pretty much no women. And it's like, are they discriminating against women? No, they would love to have women in their telescope domes at night, but no, the interest wasn't there. Okay, so let's talk about just other forms of inequality here in the capitalist society. You have a quote here from Arthur Okun, Okun, his book Equality and Efficiency, 1975. I'm not familiar with that. It isn't capitalism's fault that infants differ in endowments at the starting line of birth and even of conception. Such differential talents are, by definition, hereditary rather than environmental. They are given to the individual by his parents rather than developed or earned by him. Thus, they preclude truly fair starts. Should everyone therefore stop running races? Obviously not. In real track meets, no official has ever disqualified a runner for having fast genes. Well, okay, so then that brings up, Lyndon Johnson's famous line about, you don't take a poor, black child here and bring him to the start of the race, and he's had, just the worst environments and diets and crappy environments in schools and so on. I expect him to compete fairly. I think there's an argument to be made there. How do we the playing field should be level at some point. The question is, have we done enough to correct for that? I don't know. How do you think about that overall?
Yeah, I think much the same way. You should provide education and nutrition so everyone has a fair start at the beginning of life. But then you shouldn't try and sort of tamper with the system if it produces results you don't like. So if some category of some group in society doesn't get its proportionate number of places in a university, you shouldn't institute a quota like Harvard and other places do. You should continue simply to admit people on their merit and try and solve whatever problem you think you have by other means.
Yeah. Well, I guess that gets back to that blank slate model. The incorrect sense that a lot of people on the left have is that if there's a genetic component at all, then there's nothing we can do about it. Well, that's not true. Even things that are highly heritable are highly still changeable if you understand what the underlying genetics are.
Right. Yeah, I'm sure that's true.
So then I was going to read a quote here from Charles Murray. This is from his book, Coming Apart, which I thought was a really powerful book. And the reason I'm reading this is because this other idea that you have to go to an elite university or college to be successful in life, and therefore we have to pay for everyone's college because that's the way to go. What happened to trade schools? What's wrong with that? When I was in high school, I took electric class and metalworking class and woodworking class. I still have some of the things I made in high school. So here's what Charles Murray writes. A man who is holding down a menial job and thereby supporting a wife and children is doing something authentically important with his life. He should take deep satisfaction from that and be praised by his community for doing so. If that same man lives under a system that says the children of the women he sleeps with will all be taken care of whether or not he contributes, then that status goes away. I'm not describing a theoretical outcome, but American neighborhoods where once working at a menial job to provide for his family made a man proud and gave him status in his community, and where it now doesn't. Taking the trouble out of life strips people of major ways in which human beings look back on their lives and say, I made a difference. I think, I forget when Coming Apart that was like in the 80s, I think, right? Let's look that up. 18, yeah. That was early on, well before the bell curve. Coming Apart. I don't see the date on it. There it is. That's 2012. No, but that's a later version of Coming Apart. I think that was back in the 80s. Anyway, he identified a problem that's even getting even worse. Declining rates of marriage and fertility. You want to talk about that a little bit? What you see as the implications for the future of society?
Well, I think this is one of the major ways in which our ignoring of the evolutionary structure of human society has led to great harm. Evolution does everything it can to make societies survive, and the key to that is having children. And key to the human situation is having families which are the best environment to raise children. So our society, by inadvertently, I think, has done many things to weaken marriage, as a result of which the rates of marriage are in sharp decline, not so much in the elite classes, but in the rest of society. They are declining, and more children are born out of wedlock, which means that not only are the birth rates going down, but the children born out of wedlock in single-parent families are disadvantaged with respect to children who grow up with both parents. So these are two very serious defects which our modern societies have have introduced in terms of the integrity of the family. And of course, this is all tied up with the fact that more women are seeking careers, are postponing having children. Uh, the more you look at it, the more you see that all evolution's of arrangements and safeguards are being subverted in one way or another. Uh, and and this is bad, not from any moral sense, but simply biologically. If we do not sustain our populations, we are on the path to extinction, which may sound dramatic, but birth rates have fallen very sharply throughout the Western world, I think almost globally, except in Africa. And unless you reverse this decline in birth rates, then eventually there will be no more people. And it's very hard to reverse birth rates. So there are many countries that have been grappling for decades with falling birth rates, particularly South Korea, for example. And everything you can reasonably think of, every incentive you can imagine, paying people money to have babies, giving paternity leave, none of this has worked. It doesn't change women's decisions not to have babies in any way.
Yeah.
So it's a real problem.
Right, exactly. Well, so the 1960s concern about overpopulation, the population bomb.
Right.
Even Paul Ehrlich, he was on the show, admitted he was wrong. But you would think they'd take some credit for this. Look, we've reversed the overpopulation trend. Well, I just had an economist on the show, Dean Spears is his name, and his book is called After the Spike. The
Uh,
spike being about 10 billion people in around 2050, 2060 or so. And then it's going to go back down. By 2100, it'll be back down to where we are now, maybe slightly lower. By 2200, it'll be could be 1 or 2 billion and just keep going. Now, the question is, will it just go to utter collapse? So here I'm reminded of Stein's law. Things that can't go on forever won't.
right.
But then the corollary to that, things that can't go on forever can go on a lot longer than you think they can.
Uh, that's good.
So, yeah, but as an economist, he's concerned about just the decline of growth of economies, which probably do require some expansion of populations and consumption and production and so on. Maybe not, but that's his concern, and he has a whole chapter on what you just described. All the government experiments over the decades trying to do something about populations, and they don't work. Tax breaks and incentives and paternity leaves, maternity leaves, and all that stuff. It just doesn't seem to budge the numbers.
Well, I think he's right, too, about the need of economies to expand. And if you have a shrinking economy, then you have a shrinking workforce supporting an increasing number of old people. So you have to raise taxes, which is unpopular and will slow growth. There's the military concern. You may not have enough people to man your army, so you have to hire mercenaries, which is a very dangerous expedient. There are all kinds of bad things that happen when your economy shrinks.
Yeah. Well, I'm concerned about that because I just started collecting Social Security last year, and we need young workers because
Yeah,
I know
absolutely.
the money's not actually there that they took from me. That money's long gone.
Yeah, there's a Ponzi scheme.
It is kind of, yes, exactly. We need people to keep paying into it. Yeah, it is that kind of thing. All right, current events. Trump seems to be disrupting the Westphalian order, as it's called, or the world order, or the kind of the old school way of how nations should be interacting with each other. He seems to be throwing a wrench into that. What is this Westphalian order? When did that start? And is this a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, it's surely a good thing. I mean, it came out of the religious wars of the Middle Ages, in which Protestants slew Catholics and vice versa with enormous abandon. And after enormous bloodshed that left much of Europe depopulated and its cities razed, people realized this wasn't the way to go, and that each society should recognize the freedom of other societies to worship as they wished. So the the Westphalian order sort of was expressed in this sort of simple formula, curious regio eius religio, which means whoever has the region, let him decide the religion. So this meant that Protestant kings no longer went to war with Catholic kings, and from that simple beginning grew the idea of settling things by negotiation, of keeping a balance of power, of uh, uh, avoiding war by sort of accepted rules that essentially respected the integrity of other countries, and of not conquer them by force. So these sort of periods of Westphalian peace have been very successful. And particularly, I mean, they don't last forever. I mean, Napoleon broke up the Westphalian regime that had emerged in Europe, but in the wake of Napoleon's defeat, we had the Congress of Vienna and a sort of long period of European peace that lasted to the First World War. And after the Second World War, essentially, we've had another a period of peace which has been underwritten by American power. So the thing about Westphalian systems is that they work best if you have a hegemon, a leader to enforce them. So after the Congress of Vienna, it was Britain with its sort of navy that could impose peace on the European countries. And in recent times, it's been the United States with its international system that has essentially brought enormous prosperity through peace by allowing countries to develop as long as they obey the Westphalian rules, to which, of course, Putin's invasion of the Ukraine is an egregious exception. But that's the system. It's sort of tenuous, it's fragile. It's another example of trying to restrain human nature, to restrain the natural tendency to fight with your neighbor or ally with other groups against him. Just as we impose monogamy on men, the Westphalian system sort of imposes peace on nations, but it's a fragile one.
Yeah, I brought up Trump because you kind of see a division in the GOP between old school conservatives like Bolton, who was just appalled that Trump would sit down and talk to Putin. You can't talk to Putin. This guy's an evil dictator. We just got to, just show us strength and use force. And that's the way it works. And Trump is like, well, I'm going to try something different. So, I mean, that's the point of this. We've had this system in place for centuries, and don't try to muck with it. Don't go talk to Kim Jong-un. He's a nut.
Yes, it's a very interesting departure from established norms that Trump has in hand. I mean, it's too early to know how successful it will be, but as if he's approaching Putin as if Putin was a sort of fellow real estate magnate,
right?
And so you don't want to piss him off. You want to sort of embrace him, make it easy for him to make concessions. Don't treat him as a sort of war criminal. I mean, it hasn't worked. This approach hasn't worked yet, but as you suggest, I think it's worth trying because no one knows what else to do.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I don't see anything wrong with talking to people. At least if they're talking, they're not killing. Well, he's back to doing that, I guess. But yeah, I mean, as opposed to what? Just another 4 years of funding Ukraine and just drag it out, and tens of thousands more die every month or whatever it is. How about just try something different? I don't know. But I mean, I do understand these political rules that have been in place. Okay. So, can you see in the far future where there are no nation states, where, let's say, political borders are so poor, let's say economic borders are so porous, where trade is so free that no one really wants to fight? The McDonald's theory of peace, right? That countries that trade together are less likely to fight. If you extrapolated that out to just completely porous economic borders, maybe wars would continue to decline.
Well, I think trade has a significant sort of pacifying effect, but the problem is that the best way we've yet come across for people to organize themselves is in the form of nations. So as long as you have nations, then you're going to have the possibility of discord between them. Um, if we have if we had a complete international system with some benevolent hegemon, perhaps the U.S., to organize it, then we could get back to the way we were.
Hmm.
I don't see much hope in abolishing borders, because how would you organize a great sort of clot of a great mass of humanity? Pe- people just people organize themselves in groups uh, that essentially correspond to tribes or nations, and
Hmm.
it goes against human nature to say, well, everyone's equal, borders are old-fashioned, we can all get along together.
I guess the answer to that is we can't all get along together. There's just bad people, and that's never going to change. And so you need so the idea of a one world government. I call this the fixing the potholes problem. Yeah, what's the one world government run out of Brussels going to do about the pothole right out there on my road? Nothing. Not going to get done. So you need local principalities.
Right. I'm afraid that's true. But I think evolution has just constructed our minds to classify people as in or out, and we're always going to fight the exterior force.
Yeah. All right, that's a good place to wrap it up. I'll read the final paragraph of your book, which I really enjoyed. Lasting solutions will be found only within the framework of human nature. This set of behaviors, whatever its frailties and failings, is the best that evolution could devise for constructing human societies and ensuring their survival. Politics and culture can sometimes moderate these behaviors for better, but stretched too far, the natural bonds that sustain the fabric of society will tear asunder. That's almost as good as Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural, right? The better angels of our nature. That's what we have to work on. All right. Thank you, Nicholas. I really appreciate it. There it is again, The Origin of Politics.
Well, thank you so much.